I have told this story 3 times under oath and twice more off the record, in back rooms that don't appear on any base schematic, to men who wore no insignia and took no notes. Each time I told it the same way. Each time I watched their faces do what faces do when they hear something that doesn't fit the box they brought with them. They would nod. They would write nothing. They would leave. I am telling it again now because I am old and because I no longer care what they do with it. My name is Elias Vance. I held the rank of Sergeant, 4th Forward Containment Unit assigned to the Mojave Exclusion Zone in the 17th year after the Meridian Compact dissolved and the cities began their slow, deliberate process of becoming something other than cities. I had been in the zone for 11 months when the object came down. 11 months of hard pan and heat and the particular silence of a place that has been emptied of everything it once held. You develop a relationship with that silence. You stop fighting it. It becomes the baseline against which everything else is measured, and most things come up short. I did not see it fall. I was 3 clicks west of the primary impact site, running a perimeter check on a section of hardpan that hadn't been surveilled in 6 weeks, when the sky went white. Bright, not like a flare or a detonation. White, in the way that absence is white. Like something had been subtracted from the air above me, rather than added to it. My eyes did not hurt. The light did not bleach or blind. It simply was, for approximately 2 seconds, complete in the sky above the eastern quadrant, and then it was gone. Then the ground shook, once, the way a sleeping dog flinches in a dream. Then nothing. I checked my equipment. Everything was operational. My dosimeter showed nothing, which was the first anomaly. Because white flashes in the zone were almost always associated with equipment failures in the old test infrastructure buried under the hardpan. And equipment failures in that infrastructure always tickled the dosimeter. This one had not. The sky was normal again. The air tasted exactly as it always tasted, which is to say of mineral dust, and the particular dryness that lives below a certain humidity threshold and never leaves. The command reached me 12 minutes later. They said a meteorological anomaly had been logged. They said I was the closest asset. They said to proceed to the coordinates. They were transmitting and report what I found. I want to be precise about what they actually said, because in the years that followed, there were men who claimed command knew what that object was before I reached it. Men who suggested that the whole deployment to the zone was a setup, that I had been positioned deliberately, that 11 months of hardpan perimeter work was preparation for this specific task. I don't believe that. I believe they thought they were sending a sergeant to look at a rock. I believe because I know command, and command does not, as a general institutional practice, plan 11 months ahead for a contingency they don't know is coming. Command plans 11 months ahead for contingencies they understand, and they do that imperfectly. They are not capable of the other kind. The object was the size of a transit bus, roughly spherical, and it sat in a shallow depression in the hardpan, as though it had been placed there rather than thrown. The surface was crystalline, not like quartz, not like anything I had vocabulary for at the time, not like anything I have found vocabulary for in the years since. It was faceted in a way that suggested geometry, too precise to be natural, each face meeting the next at angles that satisfied some mathematical condition I lacked the education to name. And the facets caught what little light was left in the late afternoon sky, and held it, turned it, gave it back wrong. Not distorted, wrong. The returned light was the same wavelength, but it carried something the original had not. The way a word repeated back by someone who understands it differently than you do carries a freight the original didn't. There were lines running across the surface, not cracks, lines. Circuit traces on a board the size of a building, etched into the crystal, with a precision that made the best manufacturing I had ever seen look like cave painting. They ran in patterns that changed depending on the angle of view. Not because they were moving, but because the geometry of the object's surface meant that any given sightline intersected a different configuration of them. I walked a partial circle around it, trying to find a vantage from which the pattern resolved into something familiar. I did not find one. The depression around it was scorched, but the hardpan immediately beneath the object was not. Whatever had cushioned the landing, if it had landed, if descent was even the right word for what it had done, the heat had been managed. directed, expressed in a precise radius around the object's equatorial plane and nowhere else, like a calculation rather than a consequence. The object had not fallen, it had arrived. I reported what I saw. Command told me to hold position and not approach. I held position for 4 hours. The sun moved. The shadows of the object's facets moved with the sun, drawing slow lines across the hardpan that had a quality I can only describe as deliberate, though I understand that is not a rational description of shadows. The wind came up in the 3rd hour, which it does in the zone in the late afternoon, and the object made no sound in it. Nothing rattled, nothing resonated. It sat in the wind as though the wind were a thing that happened to the world but not to it. At some point in the 3rd hour the object opened, not cracked, not broke, not exploded outward the way you'd expect of anything that had absorbed the energies that must have been involved in whatever transit had brought it here. It opened. The facets drew back from the equatorial line in a sequence that moved too fast to track individually, each one folding away from the center with a smoothness that had nothing to do with hinges or mechanics. And from the interior came a light that I can only describe as interior, as if the light had been inside me all along, and the object's opening had simply made me aware of it. I did not feel warmth, did not feel cold. I felt recognized. He stepped out. I say he because he was wearing a man's body. I understood standing there, in the dimming desert with my rifle at low ready and my mouth completely dry, that the body was not his. It was a thing he had found useful, or perhaps a thing he had constructed for the specific purpose of walking among us, without causing the kind of immediate structural failure in the human nervous system that his actual appearance would presumably cause. The man he appeared to be was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, bare to the desert air, and apparently indifferent to the 40-degree temperature differential between the day's peak and the zone's evening drop. His skin looked like skin. His hands looked like hands. The proportions were correct. The movement was correct. His eyes were the thing. They were the color of deep water in a place no sunlight had ever reached, and they moved across the landscape with the patience of something that had been watching for a very long time. Not the patience of someone waiting, but the patience of someone who has been watching so long that patience is no longer a posture they adopt, but simply the structure of their perception. They moved across the desert, across the scorched ring, across the horizon, and then they moved to me. He looked at me. I have been looked at by men who wanted to kill me. I have been looked at by commanders who were deciding whether to spend me. I have been looked at by a prisoner once, a young man who had done something terrible and knew it and was waiting for the consequence, and his eyes had that particular quality of a thing already gone. None of it was like this. The being. I started calling him that immediately, in my own head, because nothing else fit. Looked at me the way a craftsman looks at a piece of work he has invested a long time in, and is now deciding whether it is worth salvaging, with cruelty, not with contempt. Particular sorrow of someone who has made a thing with a specific purpose in mind, and is confronting the distance between that purpose and what the thing has become. He found a skull in the debris field, an old one, coyote, probably, bleached to chalk by years in the desert sun. He picked it up with both hands and held it at chest height, and he spoke to it. I was close enough to hear. I was close enough to understand most of what he said, and to miss the rest in ways that I have spent considerable time since trying to reconstruct, without full success. He was cataloging. He was listing to a dead animal's skull the specific failures of the species he had made, and the list was not a vague indictment. It was specific, precise, lineated, with the quality of something that had been accumulating for longer than human language could easily hold. He named patterns, he named trajectories, he named the distance between what the capacity had been and what the capacity had been used for. And he named it without metaphor, without the softening that humans use when they are describing pain, with the flat accuracy of someone reading the final column of a ledger that has been building for a very long time. I stood at low ready and listened to this for approximately 20 minutes. When he finished with the skull, he set it down with something I can only call care. Not the care of grief, but the care of acknowledgement. The gesture of someone placing a document on a table after reading it fully. And he looked at me again, and he said, You will take me to them. His voice was, I won't say beautiful. I won't say terrifying. It was precise. It carried no effect, no color, no waver, no invitation. It was the voice of something that had never needed to persuade, and had therefore never learned to modulate, never learned the human trick of packaging information in emotional texture to make it easier to receive. It was simply a statement of what was going to happen, delivered at the frequency of fact. I said, yes, sir. I don't know why I said, sir. I have thought about it many times. The best answer I have arrived at is that some part of my brain, the very old part that still carries the original hardware from when we lived in the open, and something vast could come out of the dark at any moment, recognized what it was dealing with, and filed the appropriate social response before my conscious mind had finished processing. The old brain knows more than it lets on. In this case, it was simply right. We walked east, toward New Meridian. First 3 hours were quiet. He walked at a pace I had to work to match, not because he was hurrying, but because each of his strides covered ground in a way that seemed to involve a slightly different relationship with distance than my strides did, supernaturally so. Not in a way you could point to at any given step and say, that stride was wrong. Just, over time, the ground covered per step was more than it should have been. I kept my rifle slung. I tried to raise command twice. My comms were not precisely jammed. The equipment was functioning. The signal indicator was showing transmission. But every attempt produced a signal that arrived at the other end as static. Later, a technician would tell me the transmission had been received as a sine wave of impossible regularity, a pure tone at a frequency slightly outside the standard communication band, perfect and uninformative. He was very excited about this. I told him I was glad someone was. At some point in the second hour, I tried speaking to the being. Not about the situation. About the landscape. First, because the zone has a quality in the evening light that I had spent 11 months learning to see. And, speaking about the landscape felt like something I was permitted to do. He did not respond to the landscape. He was looking at it with his full attention, which by this point I had begun to understand was something qualitatively different from the way I looked at things, but he did not respond to my descriptions. He was already reading it more completely than I could describe it. I asked what he was going to do when we reached the city. He said, account for it. I asked what that meant. He said, there are those in your city who have eaten the effort of others. For so long they have forgotten it is not their birthright. There are those who have turned the machinery of law into a tool for their own comfort, and the exclusion of those the law was constructed to protect. There are those who sell the bodies and the futures of others as a market commodity, who have reduced the fact of another person's existence to an extractable resource. I made this species for better than this. I said, with respect, sir, you made a species that can do better than this. That's not the same as one that will. He stopped walking. I stopped walking. The desert was very quiet. The wind gone, the hardpan giving back the last of the day's heat in waves that rose and bent the horizon. He looked at me with those deep water eyes and said, you are afraid? I said, yes. He said, not of me. I said, no. Of what you're going to do when you see the full inventory. The inventory is large and it is specific, and some of it is very bad. I am afraid that the badness of it is going to dominate the accounting in ways that are not entirely fair to the rest. He considered this for what felt like a full minute. The desert has a way of making silence weigh correctly, not oppressively but accurately, and I stood in it and let it do its work. Then he said, what rest? I said, that's what I'm hoping to show you. He walked again, and I walked with him, and he said nothing more until we reached the outer perimeter of the zone at dawn. The perimeter guards did not stop us. The being walked through the checkpoint gate. It was locked, solid steel construction, rated against vehicle impact, and he walked through it as though the lock were a suggestion he had considered and decided not to honor. The gate did not break. The lock did not break. It was simply that neither of them applied to him. Two privates on duty pressed themselves against the guardhouse wall with the expressions of men whose understanding of how the physical world operates had just been revised fundamentally and without their consent. I handed one of them my sidearm and my zone identification and told him to radio command that Sergeant Vance was entering the city with the anomaly, that I was in no distress, and that I needed a medical team and an intelligence officer to be staged at the Eastern Sector entry point. Took both items and nodded and did not move for the 30 seconds I watched him. I do not know when he moved again. I expect it was after we had cleared the horizon, New Meridian. In the 17th year after the compact dissolved, New Meridian was still nominally a city. It had transit infrastructure, power distribution, water management, a governing body, courts, commercial districts, and approximately 800,000 people who were trying to live inside all of that with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of delusion about whether the structure they were living inside was working in their interest. Some of them knew. Most of them had their suspicions and chose not to examine them too closely, because examining them too closely produced a picture that was too large to act on individually, and individual action was all they had. The city's problems were not complicated. They were old and specific and thoroughly understood by everyone who spent any time studying them. Councilman Hargrove, who had been receiving infrastructure contracts in exchange for full money decisions for 11 years, who employed through 3 layers of corporate intermediary the gang operations that controlled the distribution corridors in the city's eastern sectors. Attorney Schoen, whose firm had made its name defending the corporate entities that had systematically stripped the city's water rights and resold them at rates that put clean water beyond reach for the outlying communities. The operations that ran in the buildings off the Western Transit Hub, where women, sometimes very young women, were processed into the service economy through debt structures designed to be mathematically permanent, where the debt grew faster than any income the structure permitted the debtor to earn, where escape was a theoretical condition the framework never actually allowed. These were not secrets. They were open, documented, cross-referenced, and politically protected. Protection was the product of the same infrastructure Hargrove had built. Officials who owed their positions to the same network. Enforcement structures that drew their budgets from the same sources. Legal interpretations that had been shaped by the same attorneys over the same 17 years. It was a closed system. It was not impenetrable. Reyes had been working a penetration from the outside for 4 years, but it was close. Close enough that the people living inside the city's machinery had mostly made their peace with it. The way you make peace with a chronic condition. You manage. You minimize. You find the corners where it isn't fully expressed, and you live there when you can. The being read all of this within his first 2 hours in the city. He read it the way I imagine a geologist reads a landscape. Not looking at the surface, but at the structures that produce the surface. Pressures and the time and the accumulated consequence of forces that had been running for longer than any individual element of the result. He read it completely and without mercy, and without the comfortable hedging that humans apply to difficult knowledge. He knew what it was. We encountered the first of Hargrove's distribution crew 6 blocks inside the eastern sector boundary. 4 men, young, built by years of the specific fitness that comes from physical danger rather than from gyms, armed with the kind of hardware that doesn't come from legitimate supply chains, doing what they did every morning in that part of the city, which was standing at a specific corner and being visible, because visibility was the product. Their presence was the transaction. The message was, this block is claimed. The message was received by everyone who passed through it, and it produced the specific tax of attention that claimed territory always produces. The adjustment of route, the avoidance of eye contact, the slight acceleration of pace that tells you a corner has a cost. They noticed us. Walking without clothes was a more unusual sight than I was, and one of the 4 said something to the others that was not kind. The legmouth that followed had the quality of performance. It was not comfortable laughter. They were uncertain. They had been trained by their circumstances to express uncertainty as aggression, because uncertainty in that corner expressed any other way was a vulnerability. The being stopped and looked at them. I do not know exactly what they experienced when he looked at them. I can only tell you what I observed, which is that the 4 of them, men who had spent years becoming hard specifically, so that nothing could reach them through the hardness, went pale, not one at a time simultaneously. as though whatever the being had directed at them had found something underneath the constructed hardness that the hardness had been built to protect. Something younger and less armored, and still, despite everything, present, and had spoke to it directly, in a language that bypassed everything between. The leader of the four, a man named Morrow, dropped to his knees in the middle of the street. Not from any physical force the being applied. He knelt. The way you kneel when something finally makes you fully and inescapably aware of what you have been doing, and the accounting of it arrives all at once, before you have time to build the usual defenses against it. The other three stood very still, in the way of men for whom the available options have all become simultaneously unavailable. The being said to Morrow, "You know what you are." Morrow said nothing. His eyes were wet in the way that eyes are wet, when something long damned finds a crack. The being said, "The knowing is the beginning. What you do with the knowing is the rest. The rest is yours." He walked on. I followed. I looked back once. Morrow was still kneeling. The other three had not moved. I do not know how long they stayed that way. Later, through the disclosure process that unfolded over the following months, that Morrow had gone to Reyes's office that same afternoon. He had walked in and sat down and said, "I know things." And Reyes had gotten out a recorder and said, "Start anywhere." This happened 3 more times in the following hour, in varying configurations. A city official who had been collecting facilitation payments from the distribution network was addressed on the front steps of his own building, in public, without dramatics. The being simply stopped in front of him and looked at him for perhaps 10 seconds, and the official sat down on those steps with his face in his hands and remained there while he stepped around him until his assistant came out and found him still sitting, asking what was wrong, and not getting an answer, because there was no answer short enough to give on a public staircase. 2 of Scohen's associates were in a sealed vehicle, being transported through the northern corridor, when somehow, and I was present for the route that brought us near that vehicle, and I watched it happen, and I still cannot explain the mechanism. They became aware of the being's presence through tinted windows and sealed doors, and required the vehicle to stop and allow them to exit. They exited and stood on the pavement in the business attire they had put on that morning. For a day of work they now understood differently than they had at breakfast. With expressions that had moved past shock into a territory I don't have precise language for, the vehicle eventually drove away. They remained. I was not horrified by any of this. I want to be clear about that. These were men who had spent years constructing elaborate systems of insulation between their choices and the consequences of those choices. And what the being was doing was simply removing the insulation. The choices were still their choices. The consequences were still their consequences. Nothing had been invented or fabricated. The accounting was only accurate. What I was, the word I kept returning to, was apprehensive. Because I could see the shape of where the arithmetic was heading. And I could also see that the being had not yet seen what I needed him to see. I caught up to him outside a water distribution facility in the northern quarter, and I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "To the source." I said, "Councilman Hargrove's administrative building is 3 blocks north. Before you get there, I need you to see something." He stopped. He looked at me with the patience of something that has all the time there is, which paradoxically makes patience feel less like a virtue and more like a warning. I said, "What you're doing with the men on the street, the accounting, it's right. I'm not arguing the ledger. I'm asking you to complete the ledger before you decide what to do with it. Because the ledger has more than one column, and I think you've been reading one of them." He said, "What is the other column?" I said, "Come with me, and I'll show you." The Hayward Complex was a converted industrial building 3 streets east of our position, a hulk of poured concrete and salvaged steel that had been subdivided in the 2nd year after the compact. Dissolved by a group of families who had been displaced from regulated housing by the rent restructuring that followed the compact's failure. The building was technically in a disputed ownership status. The corporate entity that had held the title had dissolved, and the receivership was still working through the courts 17 years later, which meant the building existed in a legal interstitial space that the residents had used, pragmatically, as a form of informal security. No one could evict them, because no one had clean legal standing to evict them, and Reyes had filed 3 separate motions, ensuring it stayed that way. The community that had taken up residence was approximately 70 people when I had first heard about it, somewhat larger when we arrived. They maintained the building collectively, not through formal assignment, though there were informal roles and informal accountability, but through the kind of practical mutual commitment that forms in a community that understands it will either hold together or not hold at all. The roof garden was its most visible achievement. Actual functioning rooftop food production operation, improbably established in the soil of salvaged planter beds on an industrial building's roof in a city that had not been designed for food production at any level, producing tomatoes and peppers, and several varieties of greens and herbs with a yield that supplemented the community's food budget by somewhere between 20 and 30%, depending on the season. The being moved through the building's ground floor with his attention on full, which I now understood well enough to find both terrifying and necessary, because his attention at full was the experience of being known completely, and being known completely by something that knew what human beings were supposed to be capable of was not the same experience for a community that was doing something approximating that capability as it was for men who had been spending their capability on extraction and protection payments. On the roof, he stopped. He stood in the middle of the garden, and he still in a way he had not been still since he stepped out of the crystal. Okafor came to him. She was a broad-shouldered woman somewhere in her 50s, wearing the kind of clothes you wear to do physical work, with the unhurried authority of someone who has been running an operation for long enough that she no longer needs to perform authority. She simply has it, functionally, the way a structural beam has load-bearing capacity. She came to him because he was in her garden without being on her list. She said, "You can't be up here without being on the list." The being said, "I made this." Okafor said, "You did not." "I made this. Delgado and Torres and the Kwame family and 6 weeks of my own back going out in the sun so these beds would sit level. I made this." "What's your name?" the being said. "I meant I made the capacity for this. The hands that built it, and the decision to build it, and the knowledge required, and the stubbornness to continue when the first planting failed." Okafor looked at him for a moment. Assessment of unusual people was clearly refined by years of running a building that had its share of them. She said, "Then go make it somewhere else. We have work to do before the afternoon heat." He stood there for another 30 seconds, which in a conversation with Okafor apparently constituted an overstay, because she said, "You can stand there or you can help," and handed him a trowel. He helped. He worked the beds for 2 hours with the focus of something that had not used its hands for physical labor in a very long time, and was applying to the task the same attention it applied to everything, which meant the beds he worked were worked with a thoroughness that Okafor examined afterward and said, without inflection, "Not bad." Sat against a low parapet wall, and watched this, and thought about what it meant that the entity that had arrived in a crystal from beyond any distance I could conceptualize was putting soil around tomato roots on a rooftop in New Meridian. I did not arrive at a clean conclusion. I think it was something about scale, about the fact that the same capacity that produces civilizational rot and parasitic governance, and the destruction of the vulnerable also produces this, and that the distance between them is not the distance between different species, but between different choices made by the same species in different circumstances. That the building is always the same building, and what grows in it depends on who decides to tend it. He did not speak again until we were back on the street, with clothing I had found for him at a salvage exchange 2 blocks south. He accepted the jacket and pants and boots, without comment, and wore them in the way of someone who has accepted a tool as appropriate for the current task. On the street, walking south from the salvage exchange, he said, "How long has the Hayward building been running?" I said, 17 years. "Since the compact," he said. "And in those 17 years the city's administration has made no effort to support it." I said, "No official effort. Unofficially, Reyes has kept the ownership dispute in motion, specifically to maintain the building's legal ambiguity. A clean ownership ruling in either direction would end the community's ability to operate there. The ambiguity is the protection. He said, they are surviving in the gaps of a broken system. I said, most of what works in this city is surviving in the gaps. The gaps are where the system hasn't fully reached yet, or where individuals have found ways to make the system work despite itself, or where the system's own incoherence has accidentally produced a space that something useful can occupy. It's not stable, it's not designed. It requires constant maintenance because the gaps shift as the system shifts. It is real, and it is running, and it is what exists, while the main structure is being repaired. He said, you are describing a workaround. I said, I am describing what humans do. We do not wait for the correct conditions. We work in the conditions that exist. We build workarounds, and we run them, and we maintain them. And when they fail, we build new ones. It is not elegant. It is not efficient. It is the specific texture of a species that does not stop. He was quiet for a block. Then he said, I designed this capacity into you. I said, is that a question? He said, it is a thing I had forgotten I did. I did not respond to this. I did not have a response for it. There is a particular quality to the admission of forgetting that is different from the admission of wrongdoing. It has a different moral weight, a different emotional signature. He had said it matter-of-factly, the way you note an oversight in a long project. But the matter-of-factness did not reduce it. He had made something with an intentional property, and had lost track of that property over the time it took to be disappointed by the rest of the ledger. He had come here to account for the failure and had almost missed the success, because the success was quiet and the failure was loud, and in any ledger with sufficient entries, the loud items dominate the first reading. I thought about the skull in the desert, the catalog, the cold settled anger. I thought about how long that anger had been building and what it must have taken to sustain that building, while also sustaining whatever it meant to be the thing that had made us. I did not feel sorry for him exactly, but I recognized the shape of it. The shape of caring about something for a very long time and watching it go sideways, and finding that you are unable to stop caring about it, even when caring about it is its own form of cost. We turned south toward the transit hub. He went to the western transit hub. I had known what operated out of those buildings the way the city knew it, which is to say, everyone knew, and no one said it clearly. The operation had lawyers and political cover. It had debt instruments written by people who understood the law well enough to make the instruments legally airtight. It had enforcement. It had a customer base that included people in positions that gave the operation its protection. And the protection was the real infrastructure, the thing without which the rest could not run. I tried to get ahead of him at the corner. I said, I know what's there. Let me make a call. There are prosecutors who have been building a case against this operation for 2 years. They are close. If you walk in there now and do what I think you're going to do, you may compromise the evidentiary chain and those men walk. The being said, how much longer would you have the women inside wait for an evidentiary chain? I said, not long. Months, not years, he said. They have been waiting longer than months. I said, yes, he said. Tell me what waiting has cost them. I did not answer that. I knew the answer, but there was no version of the answer that supported waiting any longer. I understood standing at that corner that I had been making the argument that I had been trained to make, the argument of process, of institutional patience, of the correct channels and the right methods, and that the argument was true, and it was also, in this specific application, being used the way correct arguments are sometimes used, which is as a reason not to do the harder thing right now. He walked into the building. What happened in that building I will not describe in full. Some of what happened is in the sealed testimony. Some of what happened I will not put in writing because it belongs to the people it happened to, not to me. What I will say is that the men who ran that operation encountered the full weight of the being's attention and survived it physically while not surviving it in any other sense, and that this was correct, and that I stood in the doorway and watched it, and did not intervene and would make the same choice again. The women inside were seen. That is the phrase I keep returning to, because what happened to them was not rescue in the action movie sense, not a dramatic extraction, not a tactical solution to an operational problem. It was something more fundamental. Each of them was seen, specifically and individually, by something that knew the whole of what they were, and the whole of what had been done to them, and named both, clearly, without softening the first or minimizing the second. Being fully known by something that did not judge the person for what had been done to them. I watched it happen, and I cannot fully explain the effect. But I watched it register in people who had been operating inside an economy that treated their existence as a transactional input, and the registration looked like something coming back online that had been deliberately suppressed. Two sisters, Amber and Cindy. Amber was the older one. She had entered the operation first, through a debt instrument she had signed believing it to be an employment contract. She had been 23, looking for work in a city where the legal employment infrastructure had been systematically stripped by the same mechanisms that produced everything else in that ledger. And the contract had looked like a way in, and was a way into something other than what it claimed. She had spent 8 months inside it. She had a way of carrying herself that the 8 months had not been able to fully compress. A kind of uprightness that the situation had been working on, and had not entirely succeeded on. It was in the angle of her shoulders. It was in the way she turned to face you when you entered the room, rather than turning away, which, in that environment, was an act of maintenance, a daily choice to not be fully remade. When the being stood in front of her and gave her his full attention, she looked back. She did not look away, and she did not look down. She looked at him the way she might look at someone she had decided on first appraisal was not going to waste her time. Direct and waiting for information, not for performance. She said, "Are you here to fix it or look at it?" The being said, "Both," she said. "What are you?" He said, "I am the one who made you." She looked at him for a long time with those direct, waiting eyes. She looked at him the way you look at something you are deciding whether to believe. Then she said, "Then you owe us." I watched something happen in him when she said that. It was not remorse. Remorse is a specifically human texture, and he was not human. But it was a quality I had not seen in him since we left the desert. A quality that moved through the architecture of him, the way weather moves through a landscape, changing the surface in ways that are visible, but whose mechanism runs deeper than what you can see. He had carried his judgment into this city like a fact. She had turned it around and shown him the other face of it, which was his own, which was the face of the maker, looking at what making obligates. He said yes, not apologetically, not defensively. The way you say a thing when you have been resisting it, and the resistance is no longer sufficient, and there is nothing left to do but say it clearly. Cindy was standing behind her sister. She was younger by year, and she had come to the operation 6 months after Amber. Not through debt, but through the logic of a person who could not watch their sister disappear into something alone. She had done the calculation that the situation presented. Lose her sister to this, or enter it alongside her. And she had made the choice that the logic of love produces when it is working correctly, and the options are unbearable. The situation had been working on her differently than it had worked on Amber, where Amber had maintained herself through uprightness. Cindy had maintained herself through a quality that looked from the outside like fright, but was actually a fright that had been converted, over months of having no other option, into a kind of structural load. She was afraid. She had been afraid for so long that the fear had become part of what was holding her together. The way a scar is part of what holds skin together, she said, quieter than her sister. "Can you take it back? What happened to us?" The being said no. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard said, in the most terrible context in which I had ever heard anything. She said, "Then what good are you?" It was not rhetorical. She genuinely wanted to know. She was standing in that room with everything that had accumulated around her, and she was asking this entity of vast and terrible power and ancient construction what the point of all that power was if it could not reach back and undo the specific harm that had been done to a specific person who had not deserved it. It was the question that all the accounting and all the judgment and all the knelt men on the street could not answer. It was the question underneath the question. The being said, "I cannot take it back. That is not a limit I will argue around. It is true," he said. "I can account for it. The men who did this will face the full weight of what they chose, without the insulation they constructed to avoid facing it. That is what I can do, he said. I can show you that you are still here, exactly what I made you to be, which is something that endures past what should extinguish it, and adapts to what cannot be undone, and does not simplify, even when simplification is the only comfort available. I can show you that the thing they tried to reduce has not been reduced, he said. That is what I have. I understand that it is not what you asked for. Cindy said nothing for a while. Then she said, that's not enough. He said, I know, he said, with the accuracy of something that has just given a true accounting of its own limits. It is all I have. There was a long silence in that room. The afternoon light was coming through a high window at an angle that showed the dust in the air, the specific quality of suspended particles that a room has when it has been lived in under pressure for a long time. In that light, Amber looked at her sister, and her sister looked at her, and something passed between them that I was not able to read, but that the being was clearly able to read because something in him shifted again, very slightly, in the direction of continued investment. Amber turned back to him and said, what happens now? He said, that is the only question that has ever mattered. We spent 3 more days in the city. The being did not destroy anything. I want to say this clearly because some of the accounts that circulated afterward, in the zone debrief documents, in the intelligence summaries I was shown in those back rooms, with no insignia on the walls, described a more dramatic intervention. Buildings brought down, infrastructure failures, visible demonstrations of power on a scale that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. None of that happened. What happened was quieter and more permanent. He went to Hargrove's building. He went in the front entrance, past the lobby security, past the reception staff who parted for him with the expressions of people who have encountered something their training did not cover, and into the elevator, and up to the floor where Hargrove ran the administrative operation that had been running the city's underside for 11 years. I followed. I sat outside the closed office door for 40 minutes, and I heard nothing that I could make into words. When the door opened, Hargrove walked out. He was a compact man in his 60s, who had spent 2 decades constructing a version of himself that expressed nothing compromising in any context. A professional surface, smooth and reflective, that gave back what was expected of it, without revealing anything of what was underneath. He walked out of that office and the surface was gone, not destroyed, not broken, just absent. He walked past his own staff without the performance, without the deflection, without the management. He sat down in a chair in the waiting room, and he called an attorney, not Schoen's firm, Reyes. He called her and said, I need to make a full disclosure. I need you to tell me how to do it correctly, and I need you to be present. Reyes, who had been working on this specific problem for 4 years at considerable personal cost and with limited institutional support, said, I can be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 15. The disclosure took 6 hours that first session, and many more over the weeks that followed. It led to the contract network, and the contract network led to the distribution corridors, and the corridors led back to the transit hub operations, and those led to the enforcement infrastructure, and the enforcement infrastructure led to the protection payments. And by the time the full map was drawn, it covered 17 years of the city's administrative sites with specificities that Reyes said, in a recorded interview I was shown 2 years later, she had not expected to see in her lifetime. She said she thought she would be building that map piece by piece for another decade. Schoen resigned his partnership before the week was out. The partners he left behind eventually received their own accountings through the disclosure process. Morrow, the man who had knelt on the street in the eastern sector, provided 3 separate depositions. The women from the Transhub operation were referred to Reyes's office for civil proceedings that would continue for years, and would result in, among other things, the dissolution of 7 holding companies and the recovery of funds sufficient to establish an actual legal aid operation in the Hayward Building's ground floor. Being spent the 2nd and 3rd days at the Hayward complex, not with an agenda. He walked the roof garden with Okafor, and he worked the beds for hours each morning. And Okafor told him what she had learned about soil amendment in a desert climate, and he listened with the full attention he gave to everything, which in this context did not feel like judgment, but like the reciprocal of judgment, something I might call recognition. He rebuilt the south stairwell structural joint that had been failing, and that 2 residents had been trying to address with materials and skills that were almost but not quite equal to the problem. He spent 4 hours on it, using his hands, using the salvaged materials that were available, solving the problem within the constraints of what existed rather than transcending them, and the result was a joint that a structural engineer who examined it the following month described as better than the original construction. He ate 2 meals in the common room, with 3 families and the elderly man, who ran the card games and the children and Okafor's extended household. He spoke very little and listened a great deal. I sat at the edge of those meals and watched him listen, and I thought of the skulls in the and the catalog of failure, and the cold settled anger that had carried him across the hard pan, and I thought that the specific texture of these people in this room, practical jokes, and the complaints about the heat, and the argument about the card game rules, and the elderly man's account of a thing that had happened decades ago, that everyone present had heard many times, and received without impatience, that this was in the other column. This was what I had said existed, and had needed to show him, and that it was running, quietly, and without ceremony, and without heroism, in this building, and in buildings like it everywhere in the city, sustained by people who had decided, without anyone to witness the decision, to keep going. On the morning of the 4th day, he told me it was time to return. We walked back to the impact site. The desert was cold and clear at that hour, the kind of clear that the zone has before the day heat rises and bends the air, the kind that makes the distance feel measurable rather than infinite. He walked and I walked, and for the first hour we said nothing. I said, "Are you going to come back?" He said, "That depends on you." I said, "On me specifically, or on us generally?" He said, "There is no meaningful difference between the two that I have found in practice." I said, "What did you decide about whether to continue?" He was quiet for what felt like a quarter-mile of hardpan. The sun was coming up properly now, the copper quality of the early light turning to something cleaner and harder. Finally, he said, "I decided what Amber told me to decide." I said, "She told you that you owed her?" He said, "Yes." And she was correct. A maker who abandons a creation to the consequence of its worst impulses, and then arrives to judge it, has confused the direction of the debt. The failure is not only in the creation. I had that backward for a long time, I said. So the experiment continues. He said, the investment continues. The word experiment implies a detachment I am no longer entitled to. The crystal was already at the impact site when we arrived. The crystal had apparently decided not to wait. It sat in the hard pan with its petals open, and the interior light doing the thing it did. The thing I had stopped trying to describe. He stopped at the edge of the depression and turned and looked at me one last time with those deep water eyes. I said, "What should I tell Command?" He said, "Tell them what you saw." I said, "They won't know what to do with it." He said, "No, but the telling of it is still useful. Truth spoken to people who cannot yet use it is not wasted. It waits." I said, "Will you be watching?" He said, "I have always been watching. That was not the question. Question was whether I would continue. I have answered it." He stepped into the crystal. The petals closed around him with the same absolute silence they had opened with, and the object sat in the hardpan for 3 more seconds with the precision of something running on a schedule. And then it was gone, explosively, not with any discharge of energy. It was there, and then the depression was empty, and the hardpan was smooth, and the desert was the desert. I stood in it for a while. I thought about all of it in no particular order. I thought about Okafor handing the maker of the human species a trowel and telling him not bad. I thought about Amber looking at something that could have ended all of this and saying, "You owe us," and being right. I thought about Cindy asking what good he was and him saying, "I know," and that knowing being sufficient. I thought about Morrow walking into Reyes's office and saying, "Start anywhere." I thought about Hargrove in the waiting room chair, the performance gone, making the call he should have made 17 years earlier, and Reyes arriving in 15 minutes, because she had been ready for this call for 4 years. I thought about 2 children and an old man playing cards at a table, in a building with a functioning roof garden and a properly repaired stairwell joint, in a city that was not fixed and would not be fixed by any single intervention but was less broken than it had been a week earlier, and was less broken because of the specificness of specific people who had decided, without ceremony, without anyone to witness the decision, to keep tending the thing they had built. What had tipped the accounting was not the grand gesture. It was not the men kneeling on the street. It was the specific stubborn fact that in every city where the worst of what we are has captured the machinery, there are people growing things in rooftop dirt with salvaged conduit, maintaining what they were given to maintain, refusing to simplify, refusing to be consumed, owing nothing to the species and giving everything to it anyway. That was what we brought to the accounting. That was what tipped it. Not our worst, which was abundant and specific and well documented. Our most ordinary, our most unremarkable. People who would never make a record of what they were doing because they were too busy doing it. I gave my debrief. 9 hours the first session, another 6 the second. I told them everything I have told you here. I watched them write nothing. I watched them leave. I went back to the zone and finished my rotation, and then I got out. I have been to the Hayward complex 4 times since. The roof garden is still running. Okafor retired 2 years ago and Delgado's youngest son manages it now. Though Okafor comes up on Saturdays and tells him he is doing it wrong and he nods and adjusts and then does it his way, which is also right. Amber works with Reyes's legal office on the debt instrument cases. Cindy runs a morning card game with whoever shows up. The old man gone now, but the table the same, the hours the same, different players in the same chairs. The stairwell joint is holding. I don't know if he is watching. I assume he is. I hope the tomatoes are doing well. I think that is probably the whole report.